and welcome to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson from OTG Capital. We broadcast locally on Radio Northern Beaches and around Australia on the Community Radio Network through the Community Broadcast Association of Australia, and we're really pleased to be on that network. So to all the regional listeners out there, hi and welcome. We really appreciate your occasional emails. Please keep them coming in. It's nice to hear from people in places like Dalby and Armidale and out in Western Australia as well. So thank you very kindly for reaching out. It's always nice to know that there's somebody out there actually listening to us. So that's kind of good. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar, Stuart Sheary is a subject matter expert in the area of superannuation. He's been on the show before. He's with the Institute of Financial Professionals of Australia. This is the old Taxpayers Association. They've been around for over 100 years now, 104 years, I think, isn't it, Stuart?
Sounds about right? Yeah.
Sounds about right. Long time, long before you and I came along. But anyway, look, we're going to pick up on a subject because we've been talking super. It's around the tax time, and it's very topical at the moment because we're talking about today the new Division 296 super tax, which is all about the $3 million cap. Okay, so Stuart, welcome to the show firstly.
Okay. That's me.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do maybe very quickly is maybe take a couple of steps back and just go over what are the key elements of this legislation that's being brought for the next parliament that's going to be considered and obviously fought out in the media, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so the legislation or bill hasn't actually been introduced into parliament yet. It was taken off the agenda just as the election was called. But in its previous form, basically what it said was if you have a super balance above $3 million, then the earnings attributable or relating to that amount above $3 million will be taxed at 15%. So basically any growth will be taxed at 15% on amounts exceeding $3 million.
That 15% is addition to the already existing 15%?
Good point. Yeah, so if your monies are in accumulation phase, the earnings are taxed at 15%. This is in addition to that tax, but you might have an amount of money in pension phase that isn't paying any tax. So it would be 15% on that.
Okay, so either if you're in accumulation or pension phase, if you're above 3 mil, that's going to get whacked 15% over and above what is already in place, whether it be 0 or 15. There are some other factors that are quite controversial as well. What are they, Stuart?
Yes, because earnings are basically calculated as being superannuation growth rather than actual income. The controversy there is that we're taxing potentially unrealized capital gains. So our super fund may have grown in value, but we might have grown because the assets have grown. We haven't sold those assets just yet. We haven't realized a profit just yet, but we're paying tax on the growth on those assets, even though when we go to sell those assets or when the super fund actually goes to sell those assets, they might actually sell them for a loss. So there's people are upset about that. And people are also upset about the fact that the $3 million threshold is not indexed. So $3 million is a lot of money today, but is it a lot of money in 20 years' time?
And so I think it brings us to a good point. So, we've looked at this proposal. And now one of the fascinating things, and, the show's been going for about 5 years now. And so around the time when the new caps were introduced, lo and behold, I was always surprised. It was actually an LNP government that brought in transfer balance caps.
Yeah, well, the transfer balance cap was a way of limiting the tax-free earnings, if you like, on pension phase. That was introduced, I think, around 2017. So basically put a limit on how much money inside a super could enjoy tax-free earnings. And this in ways like...
And that was set at 1.6 million at the time. And when you look at the history and the fact that during the Howard era, he allowed unfettered growth, and this is where people piled in gazillions, and we're talking big money into some of these funds, these personal super funds. And so for an LNP government to come in and say, hey, we're going to limit this now, it was like, pinch me, is this real? But it actually did happen under an LNP government. Now, what's fascinating, ladies and gentlemen, and part of the discussion I want to have with you, Stuart, it was set at 1.6 million back in 2017-18 financial year. We're now in the 25-26. The transfer balance cap is now what?
It's now $1.9 million. So it has been indexed over time. So I guess the thinking might be, well, the 3 million cap should be indexed too, but unfortunately, it's not in the proposal to index the $3 million Div 296 tax. Unlike,
but quiz me this: when people talking about 20, 30 years, when a 20-year-old is going to be having a lot more money in their super at that point in time, is it fair to argue then that the TBC will have been indexed up to or even beyond the $3 million Div 296 rate now?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. It's very possible. Absolutely, people might have
argument
allowed to put $6 million into their pension account, and so that $6 million could potentially be subject to Div 296 tax.
But the thing that I guess I'm proffering is that there are two arguments there that counter the argument. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't like it being indexed, not being indexed either, but the arguments that I've read in the last few days with some counter pieces in The Guardian and some of the economic papers that I've seen going through the industry talks about eventually the TBC is going to be indexed to and beyond the $3 million cap mark. And we don't assume that Labor is going to be in government 20 years from now. So there's going to be a change of government anytime in the next 10, 15 plus years. Wouldn't an incoming new government potentially change that?
Well, history says governments don't typically change these thresholds unless they have to. So, I mean, I just think of the government co-contribution. Remember when you put in $1,000 into your super and the government would chip in $1,500? How generous was that? Yeah, they did change it, but they didn't increase it. They've reduced that down to $500. So yes, the incoming government can change things, but not always in the right direction.
I don't disagree. And, you know, one of your co-colleagues at IFPA, Natasha Panagis, and I have had many discussions about, you know, why do they keep fiddling with it? And I guess the easy answer to that is right now it's a $3 trillion war chest and it's going to be grown to $5 trillion in not too distant future. It's going to get tinkered with because people, you know, one of the big election things that they were talking about was first homeowner access to super, which I'm dead against because it's not. And it brings us to an interesting point. Stuart, maybe explain to the listeners what's been happening in the last term of Parliament around the purpose of super. What's that been all about?
Oh, yes, that's right. There was the what they have the objective of super was legislated, and I think they try to enshrine the purpose of superannuation, but we always had what we call the sole purpose test there anyway. So there's questions as to the value of that. But basically, I think what the government was trying to do was reaffirm that superannuation is there for your retirement benefits. Basically, it's not there for today's purpose, such as, you know,
or what it's primarily being used for in too many situations as estate planning and intergenerational wealth transfer. And this is where, again, one of the arguments being brought forward around this element of the cap comes around real estate and business real property and farm properties being held in super. And they're going, it's too lumpy. What if I have to dispose it? I'm paying tax, etc. And I'm sitting there going, what's it doing in super in the first place? Is that the right place for it to be? I'd like to throw that back to you as a superannuation specialist. Does that conform to a sole purpose test or the purposes of super?
Absolutely. So holding business real property inside your super would ordinarily satisfy the sole purpose test because we're holding it there for the purpose. We take the view that property will grow in value and will provide healthy rental returns. So business real property can include farmland. And of course, the transactions that often this business real property is being used by the member in their own business, and that's okay, so long as it's on arm's length terms. So that rent that's being paid is on arm's length terms. And there's no reason to say that a self-managed super fund can't invest in real estate. Real estate's been a great investment over the years.
But I'm more relating right now where the National Party has made a big point of this because their farming community have lobbied very strongly around this, saying the family farm now is in danger because of this 296 legislation. But again, I throw back the question, when you're talking about the kind of value that's associated with a lot of these farm properties, and I've seen eye-watering numbers around very large tranches of farmland now. 15, 20 years ago, nobody batted an eyelid, but we're talking about big chunks of money now transacting in farm properties. That changes the dynamic quite a lot, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So if 20 years ago, perhaps the self-managed super fund purchased the farm from the member and that farmland's now worth $10 million, then there's a potential that farmer now is going to be up for this Div 296 tax. And the income being drawn, or rather the self-managed super funds may not be receiving rent on this, or lease on this farmland that would be sufficient to pay this tax. So perhaps that farmer needs to potentially sell that property in order to pay that Div 296 tax.
And that's what they don't want to be doing. And I think it's an interesting discussion and an interesting point, because look, I'm hoping to use that very rule around business real property as a small business owner, so that when I retire, I can use the capital gains concessions that are available. And I'm sure farming communities think about this and their advisors are advising them. The difficulty becomes that the escalation in the real estate pricing has been so dramatic. I think it's caught a lot of people unawares. And so this element, not just of the $3 million cap, but the taxing of unrealized gains. And so, look, we're just about half time. I want to come back to that, Stuart, because I want to really thresh this unrealized gains issue a little bit more. Fascinating discussion. You're here on Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm here with Stuart Sherry, subject matter expert on superannuation from the Institute of Financial Professionals of Australia. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back with you in just a moment. Hi, and thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly radio program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. The views, comments, and opinions aired during our program should not be construed or viewed as financial advice. Any commentary is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should consider whether the advice is suitable for you and your personal circumstances. If in doubt, you should contact an authorised licensed financial planner. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Please search for Dollars and Making Sense in your favourite podcast platform, or check out our blog at otgcapital.com.au/blog. Hi, and welcome back to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson. I'm really pleased to have at the microphone today Stuart Sherry, subject matter expert on superannuation from the Institute of Financial Professionals of Australia. We're having a great discussion, ladies and gentlemen, about Div 296 tax. I know it may sound boring, but it's absolutely not. Now, before we went to the break, Stuart, we were talking about the taxing of unrealised gains. And I think one of the things that might help our listeners and viewers a lot. Can you explain how this is calculated?
Yeah. So let's just say, hypothetically, you start the financial year with $3 million in your super fund, and that super fund grows to $4 million. The fund has grown by $1 million. The Div 296 tax will only apply, being that 15%, will only apply on the proportion of growth relating to the amount exceeding $3 million. So in other words, only 25% of the $1 million growth will be subject to Division 296 tax. Why? Because the earnings attributable to the first $3 million are not subject to Div 296 tax. Only earnings attributable to the amount in excess of $3 million. But the problem with this is that we're taxing the growth on the super fund, albeit only the growth attributable to the excess of $3 million, but the growth all the same. So it's not actual taxable income. So your super fund will typically receive income by way of dividends and capital gains, interest, that kind of thing. That's what we'd ordinarily think about as being taxable income. Here we're taxing the growth. So particularly in the area of self-managed super funds, they might hold large assets that enjoy a substantial amount of capital growth. And so this tax could potentially tax that unrealized growth or those unrealized gains before we've actually sold that asset. And that's a bit of a problem because for two reasons. First of all, the fund may not have the liquidity to pay that tax. It is a tax that's borne by the individual, but they can withdraw the money to pay that tax liability. So there's a liquidity issue. And also the issue being that how do we know the fund will actually make a profit on that asset? Perhaps it's worth more today, but then the following financial year, when we go to sell it, it's worth less. But we may not necessarily get a tax refund.
And that highlights one of the other problems that the legislation has brought forward, whether intended or unintended, is that there's no ability to claim a refund on that loss. So if they've been taxed...
That's not entirely true in the sense that if our balance goes up over time and we pay the Div 296 tax, then the balance goes down, but then goes up again, then we can take that into account for future Div 296 liability. But let's just say our balance has gone up, we pay Div 296, then our balance goes down because of market movements, and then we need to withdraw a bit of money, and we're never captured by the Div 296 system. We're not going to get a refund on that Div 296 tax that we've paid in the past, even though the assets have subsequently gone down in value.
So I guess one of the ongoing things, IFPA plays a very important role in advising and also lobbying to government in the form of discussion papers. And I know when they open up certain pieces of legislation for discussion, I know Natasha and a lot of your colleagues have gone to Canberra, met with ministers and put their hat in the ring and said, hey, we've got an opinion and we'd like it heard. I guess from that perspective, the one thing that I'm going to be curious is the kind of administrative nightmare that's going to be created if we start taxing unrealized gains. And do you think it's the thin edge of the wedge that they're going to start saying, okay, well, we've done it to super, let's start looking elsewhere? Is there a potential for that?
Well, let's hope not. Certainly, we've been told that it's going to be confined to the superannuation. We don't like the idea of this being set as a precedent. Certainly, the government have said they don't plan on taxing unrealised capital gains in any other context, but that is what we're kind of worried about, that it does set a precedent.
So, again, let me ask the question, because, again, I'm reading these various counter pieces. This is not my opinion, this is others. There is a widely held view that reasonable people will look at this taxing of thresholds above 3 million as not something that's crazy and it affects a very, very small percentage of the population. And again, when we come back to what we were talking about before the break, the purpose of superannuation to provide a comfortable retirement. What's comfortable to one person compared to comfort for another? And so we're getting into semantics, but they're pretty important semantics, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So what you need for a comfortable retirement, I've seen many figures floating around. And as you say, the ranges do vary considerably. And it is reasonable for there to be limits on the concessions up to a point. But I guess what we're saying is that whilst there may be a need to draw back those concessions, there are limitations with this legislation that we'd like to see fixed, namely taxation of unrealised gains and the fact that it's not indexed.
I mean, one of the things I saw Greg Jericho mention in his Guardian article, saying that over 60% of the superannuation tax breaks go to the top 10% of earners. And you can sit there and blithely and very glibly respond and say, well, that's just a factor of mathematics. The reason that is because they're making a hell of a lot more money. So one needs to maybe tone that hyperbole down a little bit as well to say, I think that the top earners, if they're paying their taxes, are paying their fairer share than most. But I think that the conversation may end up coming back to the purpose of superannuation. Does the association, or even you personally, Stuart, do you see that there's going to be more discussion around what should and what should not be held in super?
Good question. I actually think that what is held in super, if you're alluding to what type of assets, is quite reasonable at the moment. So CIS requires that trustees are prudent, and also the assets held should be there to satisfy the sole purpose test. And again, we talked about farmland and business real property. I think there are arguments that alternative assets should be part of the mix. Otherwise, it would kind of leave the sector exposed if everyone's super was only invested in listed shares. So I think a bit of diversity across investments is a good thing.
It's a good point. I mean, I get pinged by my auditor every year because I'm not diversified enough. And I keep on saying, listen, having listed shares only is not diversification. I'm sorry, but because I specialize in fixed income, I keep going back to them saying, listen, I'm performing better, but they keep coming back and say, you need to diversify. And you make a good point. I'm just wondering whether sooner or later Treasury and government may end up coming back and saying within certain asset classes like real estate, where this rears its ugly head quite a bit, and maybe start putting limits on what chunks can be put into real estate, for example, because then that stops the big chunky transaction with a farm, for example, coming to bear and creating a real liquidity issue. Is that something that you're seeing from your members, or is that still just anecdotal at this point in time?
It would seem to be anecdotal at the moment. I recall that the ATO didn't like the idea of people being invested entirely, as you say, in property, but there hasn't been too much traction there. Personally, I'd like to hope that government trusts individuals and trustees to make prudent decisions. Sometimes maybe a particular individual has a knack for real estate or has a knack for a particular investment, and it might make sense for them, or they might hold a view that this particular asset class is going to outperform others. And it'd be a shame if government intervenes to prevent them from exercising their judgment.
I think one of the things as well, and this harps back to the legislation of 2017, when the LNP at that time devised and put in place a transfer balance cap and said, we need to start capping the amount that you get to. And as that gets indexed, even today, let's say, for example, we're at roughly 2 million per person. So I keep thinking about that in today's context. And my wife and I, we're in our 60s. If we were to hit that cap each, that's 4 million. And if I invest that prudently, I can take that income from the 4 million, it's all mine, tax free. Now, I look at people and go, if you can't live comfortably, and I'm using air quotes now, but if you can't live comfortably on that, I'm sitting there myself thinking, are we talking about a Monaco kind of lifestyle, or, what are we actually talking about in context of, the purpose of super? And so I think we're going to continue having these discussions. I guess I'd like to quiz you, Stuart, then, given that Parliament's going to be resitting soon in the second half of this year, is the association looking at lobbying? Do they have some papers that they're thinking of bringing forward to government for consideration?
Yes, we have lobbied government, and we have also reached out to our members, perhaps for them, those that are impacted or feel strongly about this tax, to reach out to their MP and just let them know what their concerns are. So our concerns, again, are the fact that it's taxing unrealized gains rather than actual profits, and the fact that it's not indexed with inflation. So over time, we might see that $3 million cap being quite a modest figure.
Maybe I heard a really interesting term today. They referred to Wall Street have started referring to Trump and his tariffs as taco. Trump always chickens out, and maybe this is the Labor government's way of setting a very high watermark and then coming in and going, well, tell you what, we won't worry about those bits, but we're still going to have the $3 million cap and we'll index it, and we're not going to look at index. But they've got the lion's share of what they really want to achieve in the $3 million cap. Do you think that might be a viable strategy as well?
Would that be a wonderful outcome if they do if they do allow some changes to the legislation? I think many people will accept that with
open
gratitude.
arms. With
Yeah,
open
we'll
arms.
see.
Maybe Dr. Chalmers is listening to us. Who knows? Who knows? But look, Stuart, it's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it because I think there's some interesting points of view from both sides of the discussion. I think it's not finished by a long shot. And I think we're in a wonderful situation as a society when you start thinking about the fact that we've got this wonderful treasure chest of retirement savings that we're now arguing about the best way of utilizing it. It's great because, you know, if Keating hadn't done what he'd done back in '94, we wouldn't be having this discussion at all. And
Would have imagined.
Exactly. And I keep looking at this and going, these are great arguments to have because we're getting somewhere and thinking about what a great way and a comfortable way to retire. Stuart Sherry, it's been a great conversation. Stuart from the Institute of Financial Professionals. Thank you for joining us today on Dollars and Making Sense.
Great chat next time.